The birth of the shadow La Cosa Nostra's beginnings. La Cosa Nostra, which translates to our thing, has its origins in Sicily. This was way back in the 19th century. Life in Sicily was very difficult for ordinary people then. There wasn't much trust in the government or the local police, so secret societies began to form. These groups offered a form of protection to the people. However, this protection always came with a steep price. These early Sicilian groups were the true seeds of what we now know as the Mafia. They operated under their own set of strict rules and their own brutal form of justice. Above all, they demanded absolute loyalty and complete silence, a code they called omerta. This code of silence was the bedrock of their existence. Many Sicilians decided to leave their homeland and immigrate to America. This wave happened in the late 1800s and the early part of the 1900s. They were all searching for a new life, a better opportunity. Most of them settled in large American cities. Places like New York City, Chicago, and Philadelphia became new homes. These immigrants naturally brought their traditions and customs with them. Unfortunately, some also brought the dangerous ways of the Sicilian Mafia. In the crowded, often poor immigrant neighborhoods, the Mafia found fertile ground. They began to organize themselves, initially preying on their own vulnerable communities. It was a familiar, ugly pattern repeating itself in a new land. The era of prohibition in the 1920s was an enormous gift to these emerging criminal groups. Suddenly, the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol became illegal across the United States. But of course, people still wanted to drink. The Mafia quickly stepped in to fill this void. They started bootlegging operations, supplying illegal booze to thirsty customers. They made unimaginable fortunes from this illegal alcohol trade. This vast wealth gave them unprecedented power and influence. They could easily bribe police officers and corrupt politicians. They also fought incredibly bloody wars amongst themselves for control of bootlegging territories. This period truly shaped the American Mafia into the powerful, organized criminal force it became. As these Mafia groups grew richer and more powerful, there was also a lot of chaos. Different gangs constantly fought each other for dominance. A very smart and forward-thinking gangster named Charles Lucky Luciano recognized this internal conflict. He saw it was bad for their overall business, so he played a key role in creating the Commission in the early 1930s. You could think of the Commission as a kind of board of directors for the national Mafia. It was made up of the bosses from the most powerful Mafia families. This prominently included the leaders of the 5 families of New York. The Commission's main job was to settle disputes between families and to set general rules for their criminal operations. It brought a form of dark order to their sprawling criminal empire, making them even more efficient and dangerous. The business of fear. How the mob made its money. Extortion was always a fundamental part of how the Mafia made its money. They often called it protection money. Small business owners in the neighborhoods the mob controlled were forced to pay a regular tribute. If these business owners refused to pay up, very bad things would inevitably happen to them. Their stores might suddenly get vandalized or even burned down. They themselves might get severely beaten up, or sometimes much worse. The Mafia cleverly created an atmosphere of fear, and then they sold the supposed solution to that fear. It was a truly cruel and parasitic way to earn a living, constantly feeding off the hard work of honest people. This protection racket was widespread for many decades and proved to be incredibly profitable for them. Illegal gambling was another massive source of income for La Cosa Nostra. The Mafia effectively ran almost all forms of it. They had their bookies on street corners taking bets on everything from horse races to baseball games. They operated secret illegal casinos hidden away in back rooms. These spots had card games, dice games, and roulette wheels. They also ran the numbers game, a type of illegal lottery, especially in poorer neighborhoods. Many people dreamed of hitting it big and winning a fortune. But the truth was, the odds were always heavily stacked in the mob's favor. This continuous flow of cash from gambling funded all their other criminal operations. It also gave them more resources to corrupt public officials who might otherwise try to stop them. Loan sharking, which they sometimes called shylocking, was a particularly vicious and predatory business. If someone found themselves in desperate need of money, perhaps they lost their job or had a medical emergency, and they couldn't get a legitimate loan from a bank, they might turn to the mob. The interest rates the Mafia charged were astronomically high, often impossible to repay. If you couldn't pay back the loan exactly on time, the amount you owed would quickly balloon to an unmanageable size. And the Mafia didn't send polite reminder notices through the mail. They sent their brutal enforcers to collect. Beatings were a common tactic. They systematically ruined countless lives with these predatory loans, trapping people in a terrifying cycle of ever-increasing debt and constant fear. Drug trafficking eventually became an enormous part of the Mafia's criminal portfolio. This shift particularly gained momentum after World War II. Interestingly, at first, some of the older, more traditional Mafia bosses were against getting involved in narcotics. They believed that dealing drugs brought too much heat, meaning too much unwanted attention from federal law enforcement agencies. They also thought it was a dirty business. However, the potential profits from trafficking drugs like heroin and cocaine were just too gigantic for most of them to ignore for long. This illicit business caused immense and widespread harm to communities across the country. It also led to increased violence within the Mafia itself, as different factions fought fiercely over control of the incredibly lucrative drug trade routes and territories. They also deeply infiltrated labor unions, controlling jobs and siphoning off pension funds. Kings of crime, infamous Mafia bosses, and their reigns. Al Capone stands out as one of the most globally famous gangsters in history. He was not actually Sicilian by birth, which was unusual for high-ranking mobsters, but he rose to great prominence in the Chicago outfit. During the wild Prohibition era of the 1920s, Capone effectively controlled the illegal alcohol trade throughout the city of Chicago. He was notoriously ruthless and incredibly violent. His gang of killers was responsible for the infamous St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929. In that shocking event, 7 members of a rival gang were brutally lined up against a wall and gunned down in cold blood. Capone made millions upon millions of dollars from his criminal enterprises. For a long time he seemed completely untouchable by the law, but eventually the federal government managed to convict him, not for his many murders, but for tax evasion. Charles "Lucky" Luciano was a true criminal visionary and a master organizer. He played an absolutely instrumental role in modernizing the American Mafia as we know it. He was a key figure in getting rid of the older, more traditional Sicilian bosses, often called Mustache Petes. He then helped to establish the Commission, the national syndicate I mentioned earlier. This move made the Mafia far more organized, efficient, and consequently much more powerful across the country. Luciano himself was deeply involved in a wide array of criminal rackets, ranging from illegal gambling operations to controlling prostitution rings. He was eventually convicted for his role in running a large-scale prostitution business. After serving time, he was deported to Italy, but even from there, he continued to try and exert his influence over mob affairs in America. He truly shaped the landscape of organized crime. John Gotti earned the memorable nickname the Dapper Don because he loved the media spotlight. He was always seen in public wearing expensive, flashy suits and a confident smile. He became the powerful boss of the Gambino crime family in New York. He achieved this position after boldly ordering the public murder of the previous boss, Paul Castellano, outside a steakhouse. This was a very audacious move, even by the violent standards of the mob. For a while, Gotti seemed to beat every court case brought against him. People then started calling him the Teflon Don because no charges would stick. However, his luck eventually ran out. The FBI successfully used hidden listening devices, wiretaps, and crucially, they convinced his underboss, Sammy the Bull Gravano, to break the code of Omerta and testify against him. Gotti was convicted and died in prison. Vito Genovese was another extremely powerful and widely feared Mafia boss. He ruthlessly clawed and schemed his way to the very top of what eventually became known as the Genovese crime family, one of New York's most formidable. He was known for being incredibly brutal, and was suspected of ordering numerous murders to eliminate rivals and consolidate his own power within the organization. Genovese was also heavily involved in large-scale international drug trafficking operations. He harbored ambitions to become the capo di tutti capi, or the boss of all bosses. He attempted to solidify this claim at the infamous Appalachian meeting in upstate New York in 1957. However, state police unexpectedly raided the gathering, which publicly exposed the national scope and structure of the Mafia for the first time. Genovese was later convicted on serious narcotics charges and died in federal prison, remaining a feared figure even behind bars. Breaking the silence, the fight against La Cosa Nostra. For many years, successfully fighting La Cosa Nostra was an incredibly difficult and frustrating task for law enforcement. Their strict code of silence, the infamous Omerta, was like a thick, impenetrable wall. Potential witnesses were usually far too scared to come forward and testify against them. They knew that if they talked, they or their families could face violent retaliation, including murder. Jurors were often intimidated or even bribed. Adding to the problem, even some police officers and local politicians were corrupt. They were secretly on the Mafia's payroll, providing information or looking the other way. This widespread corruption made it extremely tough for honest law enforcement officials to effectively do their jobs. The mob seemed to have eyes and ears everywhere, making the pursuit of justice feel almost impossible at times. A major and significant breakthrough in the fight against the mob came with the passage of the RICO Act. RICO stands for the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, and it was passed into law in 1970. This piece of legislation was a complete game changer. It finally allowed federal prosecutors to go after the entire criminal enterprise, the whole family structure, not just isolated individuals for single crimes. They could now charge mafia bosses for serious crimes that were committed by their soldiers and associates, based on a pattern of racketeering activity. This meant that the top leaders could finally be held directly accountable for the widespread criminal actions of their entire organization. The RICO Act led to many successful prosecutions of high-ranking mafia leaders and numerous members, significantly starting to dismantle their power. Undercover operations also became an essential and highly effective tool in this long war. Brave law enforcement agents volunteered to go deep undercover, infiltrating mob families from the inside. They gathered crucial evidence about their operations, often at tremendous personal risk to themselves and their own families. I know a little something about that kind of pressure. These dangerous operations provided invaluable intelligence. They helped to identify the key players, the hierarchy, and understand exactly how these secretive crime families actually worked on a day-to-day basis. Furthermore, informants guys from inside the mob who became willing to break omerta and testify were also absolutely vital. Their insider testimony, often given in exchange for reduced sentences or protection, helped to put many powerful mafiosi behind bars for long stretches. Breaking that sacred code of silence from within was a massive blow to their invincibility. Today, La Cosa Nostra is significantly weaker than it was during its powerful heyday in the mid-20th century. The relentless and sustained pressure from federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies has definitely taken a serious toll. Many of their most notorious bosses and countless soldiers are either serving long prison sentences or are dead. However, it's crucial to understand that they are not completely gone. They still exist and operate, particularly in their traditional strongholds like New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, and New Jersey. They tend to maintain a much lower public profile now, trying to avoid the kind of attention that brought them down in the past. They also face stiff competition from various other organized crime groups from around the world. The fight against them is an ongoing battle. Law enforcement must always remain vigilant and adapt, because these guys are constantly looking for new schemes and new ways to make illegal money and exert influence.